Hey everyone, and welcome to the brand new DF Direct Weekly. It is, as the name suggests, our weekly show where we talk about the latest gaming and technology news. Joining me, John Linneman.
Rich, it's us again. We're back.
And we are indeed back, and perhaps inevitably, Alex Battaglia.
When you said brand new there, I imagined the format was so different, but it's not. It's the exact same every week, except with new topics and new discussion.
That's right. And let's start with the very first of those topics. Okay, so I guess the biggest tech news of the week is that Apple released brand new MacBook Pros, and the laptops themselves I think look really interesting. Mini LED screens, the touch bar has gone, finally. Function keys are back, yay! But perhaps the most interesting thing from a Digital Foundry perspective is that there's new M1 Pro and M1 Max silicon. Huge performance gains, maximum efficiency by the look of it. It looks quite exciting. Alex, what do you make of this?
From just a personal perspective, I don't think the only one of us that actually has an OS X system, or I guess they call it Mac OS system, is you, Rich, right?
That's right. I have an old MacBook Pro, which I've had since 2015.
Yeah.
And the reason I have had it since 2015, and it is getting a bit long in the tooth now, is that simply put, the replacement machines have had issues. First of all, there's the keyboard. Secondly, there's the touch bar. I've got a bit of a philosophy about laptops, which is that I am not particularly keen on PC laptops. But conversely, I am really not happy at all with Mac desktops. So from my perspective, the best thing to have is a MacBook for laptop use and a PC desktop for basically everything else. But the thing about these new MacBook Pros is that the silicon there is just looking quite immense. And there's actually a really interesting scaling system going on here, where you start with the M1, which came out last year, and then things, I mean, certainly on the GPU side, things double up. We go from a maximum of 8 GPU cores to 16 GPU cores on the M1 Pro, and that doubles again.
Yeah.
32 GPU cores for the M1 Max. So we've got like a nice little family of SOCs here. The M1 was widely lauded for its efficiency and performance, seem to be capable of incredible things. And now they've basically doubled up with the M1 Pro and then doubled up again with the M1 Max.
And they use a unified memory, right? So
yeah,
absolutely.
You have a ton of RAM for GPU and normal. Yeah,
absolutely. And perhaps more interestingly, internal bandwidth is like, on the M1 Max, it goes up to like 400 gigabytes per second, which is pretty amazing for a laptop. And it actually means that the integrated GPU on there shouldn't, or will have certainly mitigated bandwidth contention limitations, as we see on the desktop side when you have these APUs. So it's a really big departure from what we're seeing on PC laptops, whereby you typically have dedicated GPU, dedicated CPU if you want performance. Everything now has been sort of combined into one sort of almost like a console-like design in a way, that everything is integrated into one chip. Everything runs from unified memory. Potentially really exciting. There's been some comparisons to the RTX 3080 Mobile. There's talk of equivalent performance and something like, using 60% of the power. I think that was the stat.
It's efficient.
Yeah, it's well. There's some parts of that though that are pretty important to mention. Obviously, the Nvidia chip is not using the same process node as that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's obviously a big difference. The Samsung density of that 8 nanometer and the thermals are not actually very top tier. So Nvidia kind of went with it back then. I always imagined probably because it was the foundry that had the sort of the open slots for their GPUs. But that's why their GA100 series actually uses 7 nanometer. It's different. But I think this is exciting from the perspective of what it means for future hardware, not in the Apple ecosystem, because I don't think this affects very much so most of our coverage. in general, because there's not a lot of dedicated Mac OS experiences that we've covered. And I don't think that'll be changing mainly anytime soon, because I think Apple's gaming aspirations are tied to the Apple Arcade at the moment. And that's just the way I look at it. But in terms of this is disruption for the SoC market, and also maybe for the future of PCs and the way we look at graphics cards and the way they integrate with motherboards, maybe as a result of the efficiency gains that we're seeing here in terms of power, it'll lead to new types of laptops in the PC space eventually, because it does make sense if you're looking at something that doesn't need interchangeable parts to start looking at a system on a chip. There's no reason you really need to take apart a laptop and put new things in it. So I think in the end, as you know, we'll see what happens after Alder Lake comes out. But this could actually mean in like 3 or 4 years' time that we start seeing very different looking laptops in the PC space, I think, because of this competition.
The interesting thing, though, is, I mean, this is all ARM technology, right? This is not x86, and we haven't seen anything quite like this on the x86 side. I mean, obviously the consoles have their integrated SoCs, but they're not exactly well suited to performance tasks necessarily. I don't know. The thing about Apple is it's always this combination of efficient silicon with their own OS experience that allows them to sort of hit these high performance targets in some ways. So it's not just the raw performance, I think. But I'm sure plenty of companies are watching what they're doing here on this front and taking notes because the claims here are very impressive. Now, I think that this is going to prove very useful for more like production tasks. Like I could see this being great for video editing on the go, for instance, right? But it's ultimately not really connected. Like you see articles saying, oh, it's like a PlayStation 5, but it's like, it doesn't really matter because this is not a gaming laptop. Like there's barely any native M1 games in existence right now. Like I don't even think Steam works on here currently, or at least not in a native form. There are ways to run non-native games, but again, you're losing performance through the translation process. So it's interesting to look at what they're doing, but it really has no impact on the gaming stuff, really, I would say.
Yet. Yeah.
Well, you know, the big question has always been when is Apple going to enter the gaming market or enter the console market specifically?
They already kind of have tried.
I don't think that it's of particular interest to them because the business model is entirely at odds with what Apple does, which is to create. Well, let's consider what PlayStation and Xbox do, which is essentially to sell the hardware at a loss to begin with, and then basically to sell the hardware so they break even, and then they can make some profit from the ecosystem side. If you look at what Apple does, and what we're seeing here in the world of the $19 cloth, is that it's a premium brand, and it's the business model isn't about giving the hardware away for free. The closest you're going to get is, I think, like the Mac Mini, which is quite a competitively priced entry level system, right? But I can't see them making consoles. And why should they have to? Because, you know, we're talking about, 10 million PlayStation 5 sold so far. Impressive on the face of it, but a drop in the ocean compared to the iPhone market, where I would suspect that the gaming ecosystem there is actually making a lot more money for Apple than PlayStation or Xbox is for Microsoft and Sony. So, yeah, I mean, this is kind of like what I find really interesting about the M1 silicon is that it's state of the art in just about every sort of quantifiable metric based on what we've seen so far and based on what we know of the M1 silicon and how it's likely to scale up. But it's going to require quite a sea change in the way Macs are used and possibly pricing in order to sort of make that market more appealing for developers to enter. While at the same time, you've got the iOS ecosystem, which is far more attractive, I'd say, for a games developer, even if it means an entirely different type of experience. So yeah, I'm really excited by the Macs. I kind of do want one, but I can't foresee. I mean, here's the thing, right? All I really want, I think the basic M1 system would be perfect for my use cases, right? But it doesn't have an SD card slot on it. So, we do a lot of work on cameras, and the SD card slot is kind of essential. And my 2015 MacBook Pro has got one. The new models haven't. Maybe next year. This is the kind of thing, right? The existing M1 Macs are based on the existing or the older chassis design. I'm kind of hoping that maybe next year the basic M1 machine will actually come with a decent port selection, and these new mini LED screens, and then maybe I'll buy in.
They've already kind of rolled it back a little bit. They've added some additional ports this time, and they've brought back stuff like the MagSafe.
When you've got a Pro machine, you kind of need an SD card slot, right?
I don't think they've gone far enough. They need many more ports to make this a proper Pro machine.
Yeah, and going back to your point about the Pro audience, I actually think this is going to do really well there. Some interesting design decisions on the SoC side. For example, you've got, as per the latest iPhone, actually, hardware accelerated ProRes encode decode. Which I think we'd kind of love to have. I mean, you've kind of got to have it in a laptop because the computational requirement to encode ProRes is significant. So to have that hardware block on there, I think is great.
So the heat generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
That wouldn't work.
I'd actually consider that editing on one of these things is probably going to be quite joyful. It's not really on a Windows laptop at the moment. I think Audi did some DF Direct edits.
Yeah, he did not have a great time doing that.
Even on a laptop, though, like your screen real estate is much crunched down regardless of the resolution. And for me, like I know John uses multiple monitors. Same with you, Rich. I still think this, like you need a really high res large screen to take advantage of like usual Premiere editing for me to make it feel good. I don't like the 1080
4K editing.
Yeah,
if you don't have a big screen or multiple monitors, you're missing a lot of detail that's in the preview window that actually. It almost makes the video look completely different when you actually export it and look at it at native resolution.
I don't even think it's that important. The preview is something, but it's more like just the real estate, like having all of your different sequences open and the different panels with all the tools, like that stuff. When crunched together, it makes it much less legible and easy to use, and it feels claustrophobic almost, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose that they want you to buy their cinema display for like $10,000. No, I don't know what it costs, but
I don't know what it costs either.
I really want to see a review of the $19 cloth. It's on back order now. It's sold out.
Dang it.
I think the other thing, there's always kind of like a bit of weirdness in Apple design, right? I mean, the legendary design fail is the mouse with the USB charging port on the bottom. So you can't.
Well,
but this time we've got the notch.
Or the Apple
Do you
Pen.
want a notch on a laptop?
No, I don't. I mean, I have one on my phone and I already hate it, by the way.
The notch stuff I think is not a big deal. I mean, it kind of sucks, but like if you look at the other prior Macs, that area where the notch is was just completely black before. It was much, much larger. So they've essentially shrunk the bezel, right? So I'd imagine what would happen is if you're running like well, not that you can play games on here, but you're running something like that on there, it would just be a black area up there, so you wouldn't even see the notch. And then the actual OS itself takes that into account.
Isn't the point that it does intrude onto actual screen real estate? It's not a part of the bezel or anything.
It does, but the UI is designed around it.
Yeah, the OS X UI is definitely.
And if you use like widescreen content, presumably it just draws just below that little notch, and the area next to the notch just blacks out, so it just looks like the original bezel. So it basically, the idea is that they sort of nest like the file, edit, whatever menu bar stuff up there next to the notch. So you're kind of getting more regular screen real estate that would have typically been used by those extra bars, right?
Yeah, it has to be then for that to work, because otherwise you're
exactly
cutting off content there. I mean, notch aside, I just think that my use case doesn't apply to this, but for those who are interested in it, it's very interesting that way. I don't think they have like a lot of specs here that still need to be proven out. You can compare it. You can compare it to a mobile RTX 3080 or whatever on a very slick looking graph with numbers that don't actually correlate to anything. But you need to show it off in common use programs like the ones that use CUDA. You need to show it off in the games, I guess, and things like that. So right now we're obviously just dealing with presentations and really awesome numbers. But as we've seen in the past before, upping the core count, upping the bandwidth on a processor does not always lead to linear speed increases that you're used to in this day and age. So I just want to wait to see the reviews. But yeah.
Yeah, and I'm actually interested to see if there is a sort of graphics testing regimen that could be applied that actually delivers these results, or even just hints at the potential, right? Because I think that's the sort of exciting thing here is it's not so much what these chips are doing as to what they're potentially capable of doing going forward. And this is kind of like one of the reasons why we don't really review iPhones or mobile phones in general anymore. Simply because the games and other sort of use case scenarios you have are designed for a mainstream audience with much less capable silicon. So what you actually end up with is maybe a game that runs almost flawlessly on the iPhone 12, running flawlessly on iPhone 13. You don't really get any kind of appreciable indication of what the silicon is actually capable of. And I don't think you do until a couple of years further down the road. It's quite interesting actually when we were looking at Fortnite on mobile. Epic basically said, well, we could run Fortnite at 60 frames per second on the last iPhone. The reason that we don't is because potentially the device could overheat and their battery life implications. So we'd rather wait until the next process node, and then you get your Fortnite at 60 frames per second, which is quite an interesting outlook. It doesn't really tie into, getting the absolute best performance out of the silicon available if they're kind of gauging things in real life scenarios in that way.
Also, while you guys were talking, I did check on the screen resolution stuff. Like the smaller one is like 3024 by 1964. That is definitely not it's a much taller resolution, so it is not like typical widescreen. So I think the use case we described is exactly what they have in mind, where if you're running like widescreen content, the top just blacks out basically.
One of the reasons why I really like the MacBook Pro is it's a 16 by 10 resolution. It really helps versus 16.9 in terms of better screen real estate.
That's why I'm using a 21 by 10 monitor myself, because it's ultra wide with a little bit more height. It works.
Good for you. Anyway, let's move on. Next topic. Wow, this one is really interesting. It is God of War. Finally, it has been announced. It's coming out on PC January 2022. Isn't that when Uncharted is coming out as well? Maybe that's a little bit later. But essentially, we have got Sony Santa Monica's the beginning of the Nordic saga of Kratos. Kratos. The breakfast cereal we know and love. And we've got new graphics features and all of the usual PC stuff, unlocked frame rates, ultra-wide support. Alex, any thoughts on this? And what about these features that are being added?
It's an interesting one because we're looking at a game designed around the PS4, which at this point in time is, really old. It's probably going to scale, assuming that the porting is done in a reasonable fashion internally by the studio, which it sounds like it is. It's going to scale really high on PC. So these extra features like DLSS are mainly about, from my perspective, on most, even the mid-range GPUs of today, are going to be all about hitting super high frame rates, more than 60 FPS. And that's what I feel like that's about. The extra other things they mentioned about like GTAO and SSDO, well, I actually don't know what the original ambient occlusion was in the original game. It was just obviously something that could run well enough on a base PS4 and base PS4 Pro, I guess I should say as well too. So it's probably not of the highest quality. GTAO, Ground Truth to AO, was made by Activision for the Call of Duty series there, and it's much closer to, like they say, ground truth, ray traced ambient occlusion in terms of the way it doesn't create halos in the usual way. SSDO was something made back in the day and really only originally adopted by Crytek, but the original version of SSDO actually has light bleed into it, like color bleed accounted for it. I don't think they're probably using that version. It's really hard to say what these extra settings will do to the image quality in the end because, you know, I've only seen the game as it looks really on PlayStation 5 in my time, really. I think there'll be nice little added benefits, but the main appeal here, I think for most people, is just going to be the unlocked frame rate experience. And that will be the game changer, so to speak. And that's what I'm looking forward to the most. On a philosophical, you know, meta level here, I'm looking right now at the GeForce Now leak. We've got Uncharted Legacy of Thieves Edition on there. God of War is on there. And since then, we've also had the Grand Theft Auto remasters being announced and a couple of other titles like, what is it? I forget. There's a couple of other smaller titles that were also on there as well. And I think this basically just points out very succinctly that GeForce Now leak is probably 100% accurate to the titles that exist in the GeForce database that have had development on PC at some point in time. So I think we should, in the next year or two, definitely expect some of these other titles there, like Horizon Forbidden West and GT7. And definitely Returnal, because that seemed always kind of like a PC title anyway, in my opinion. So I think we're just going to have to be, you know, getting ready to hear more of these announcements as time comes on. And it's always so strange how they announce these. There was little fanfare, little announcement. The thing that came up first was actually the Steam database being updated before the announcement actually happened. So that's always pretty funny. For some reason, Sony really loves just kind of like throwing these out like the door, like at the last second without giving any press notification usually. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. I'm excited. I'll definitely cover it and cover it full as I can.
So on a sort of more global level, John, what are your thoughts about Sony and PC in general?
I'll be curious to see then if Sony does kind of decide to make the jump over to the more Microsoft model and start releasing games day and date. I have a feeling that will not happen, but I don't know. It seems to be going well for Microsoft in terms of, actually making money. But they're also doing the Game Pass stuff, which is totally different. And yeah, I just don't know. It's in such a weird spot right now.
Well, there was that interview with Jim Ryan at gamesindustry.biz live, where he was kind of hinting about what the future is for PlayStation. And it was very similar to what Phil Spencer at Xbox was saying, which is essentially they're creating this world-class entertainment, but they're limited by the fact that they can only supply those experiences to console users, which amounts to at the moment PlayStation 5 10 million units thereabouts, and there's hundreds of millions of potentially billions of players out there. And he was hinting that they want to actually bring those experiences to more people. Now, how do you do that? The number one strategy would be a cloud-based solution. We know that Sony does have a cloud deal with Microsoft, who are working towards pretty much the same objective. And that does require a PC version, because I can't imagine Sony installing PlayStation 5 hardware within Microsoft data centers, just in terms of scaling, just in terms of finding those audiences. You need the infrastructure, and I suspect the reason why you would make a deal with Microsoft is because they've got that infrastructure. So yeah, the PC is going to be essential to realizing this stated strategy. I'm kind of, I don't know, the concept of playing, it's the quality of the games which makes these PC ports quite exciting, right? Because God of War to this day remains a really good, really fantastic game. But it is an old game. It's like, it's going to be well over 3 years old by the time it arrives on PC. And that might place Sony at a sort of competitive disadvantage against what everybody else is doing in the PC market at some point. Now, at the moment, I think the titles stand alone. But what have they got to lose by putting those games on PC? Because I can't see that it's going to take away from the console audience, because fundamentally I think there's a degree of overlap, but I think that they're two very different markets, right?
Yeah, that's the way it's usually been, at least on the dedicated fora that I frequent, where you have users that own all these systems, but there are people there, and a vast majority of them, that just kind of only play PC games, or those that kind of only play a game on PlayStation 5, or those that only play it on Xbox. So you're not really going to be taking away any of the audience. And I think that's something that Microsoft had to learn by going through the Xbox 360 generation and slightly the beginning of that Xbox One generation, where they're like, oh, actually, we're not doing anything negative towards our Xbox audience by bringing these out on PC. And they also, had the same, I would say, questionable fan, outrage when they announced things like Killer Instinct coming back to PC back in the day and things like that. But it didn't actually mean anything in the end. Those are just a small subset of users that get upset about these kind of things. Most people are actually just happy that the games are being played by other people, like I am. And I think in the end, they did recently acquire Nixies, and all of the, as far as I understand from that interview that was with Hammond Holst, they had the mention in that interview was, oh, that's why we brought on Nixies, at a studio with an amazing PC porting track record. And we really love Nixies' work on PC, by the way. And I think that's what their prerogative is going to be. It's going to be about bringing a close to date big title to PC at some point. I don't know which one that'll be. Maybe it might be Forbidden West.
I think that's a pretty smart model, actually, and that's how Nixies traditionally seem to work with Crystal Dynamics in the past, where Crystal was kind of left to build the game as they pleased for whichever their target platform was, and then Nixies did the other work to essentially ensure that it would run well on the PC. And I feel like that's good for everybody, and they're obviously very experienced at partnering up with the developers creating these games. So with what you're saying there, what they're trying to do here, I think that partnership makes so much sense and is really key going forward. And that does lead me to believe that they probably will start releasing more games closer to the initial release date on PC. So maybe not day and date, but I think it'll be closer. But I do think we've nearly reached the end of cross-gen for them. Like once they get the games announced, like God of War 2 and stuff in Horizon out of the way, I don't think we're going to see too many more PS4 versions. I think it'll be PS5 and PC.
I think Dreams is the big one for PC, just in terms of potential, in terms of what you could actually do with that PC port and the reach that it could have. I think that would be absolutely phenomenal. But let's move on. Some might say that this is something of a non-story, but essentially there was a story that emerged that the next generation version of The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt had been rated and certified, and the implication was that we were going to get that port sooner rather than later. And it was like, way, yay, happy days. We sounded the Tom Morgan klaxon because he's so into the Witcher 3 ports.
Witcher 3.
And it's like, okay, ready your backup footage for comparison purposes on this one. But then literally a few hours later, we had a tweet from CD Projekt RED. I'm going to read it. We have an important update regarding next generation updates of Cyberpunk 2077 and The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt for consoles and PC. Based on recommendations supplied by teams supervising the development of both games, we decided to postpone their releases until 2022. Current target for Cyberpunk 2077 is the first quarter of 2022, second quarter of 2022 for The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. So second quarter of 2022 for The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. So this ratings stuff appears to have been somewhat premature. They finish off their tweet with apologies for the extended wait, but we want to make it right. Alex.
Since we're dealing with two different things here, I'll start with Cyberpunk because that has a more controversial outing on consoles. The next gen versions we're pretty happy with, both on Series S, X, and PlayStation 5 in their current form. They're very playable. They do not have any of the eminent issues to the same degree that the base console versions have. PlayStation 4 Pro is a bit better these days, I know that. But, you know, what this is all about is, I think it's going to be about getting a 60 FPS experience on consoles that works really well natively. It's more targeted. So I think traversal around the city will probably be performing better in these native versions. And I think there will be a dedicated 30 FPS mode that adds in one of the ray tracing features from PC. And I'd imagine they'd probably go with the emissive lighting, because that's the real core of the game, is you're outside all the time. The emissive lighting really helps out. Yeah, and I think for The Witcher 3, this one's curious because, the game's pretty old at this point. And the unfortunate CD Projekt RED hack labeled this as Witcher 3 RTX in the folder name. So I think it's actually going to be a rather intense difference. It's done by Saber Interactive, if I'm not mistaken. And, they've been doing a lot of games recently that have some pretty core changes in them. Crysis 3, Crysis 2, Crysis 1 Remastered added in, Svogi, and all these other things. So I think this is going to be, The Witcher 3 is a seminal game, huge on PC, huge on console back in the day. And I think this is actually going to be some pretty big changes in there in terms of graphics, because the kind of open world design of The Witcher 3, the famous downgrade, was because instead of having manually set up global illumination set up all by the artists in the game world, and the expense that they would have in terms of development and performance, they went up with like a very light, semi-systemic version of like cube maps that update around the game world and things like that. And that, if you were to rip that out and replace it with something more systemic like ray tracing, handling a lot of the lighting in the game, you would actually have a big graphical quality upgrade at the same time as not having a super impact on the art design, because it's, it was already very light in terms of how much effect it had on the artwork in general. So I think we're going to see some pretty cool stuff actually there regarding that Witcher 3 re-release. What are they calling it? Is it called The Witcher 3 The Wild Hunt Remastered? What does it have a name? I don't know. But either way,
as far as I'm aware,
it doesn't have a name. Yeah, but I think that's going to be really cool. I don't know. What do you think about it, John? You covered Witcher 3 back in the day. What would you like to see done to it?
I mean, I tend to agree with you on that. I think the ray tracing features are critical to sort of revive the look. But also, I don't know if they're putting in the time to change some of the assets around, but I've always had issues with things like the way they render foliage in that game. It never quite looked right to me. And just, I would like to see like per pixel motion blur on characters, for instance. That would help a lot, because the animation itself is fine, not exceptional, but it's fine. And I think just adding that would help accentuate it a lot and just look better. Just things like that I think would be adequate and sort of transform the visual look of the game. Also adding higher quality HDR support would be nice. I don't think they need to overhaul it more than that. Not that that's not already a decent amount of work, mind you. But it's more so, it is interesting to me that this got pushed back further than the Cyberpunk delay. I kind of expected it to be the inverse. But I'm sort of heartened that they're essentially taking this time again, because it's very obvious last year they got burned by, I would say, shareholders and top men at the company were responsible for releasing it in a state that I'm sure none of the actual developers wanted to release the game in. And I think they got burned so bad by that, plus the leak, that they don't want to take chances this time. I don't think we're going to see these until they are actually ready, just for that reason. So they can't afford to make that mistake again. It would be the death nail, especially with the console version of Cyberpunk. By then, the next gen machines will have been over a year old, and I think people are expecting a lot from it. And I think the potential there is the potential is there to deliver a lot. And just adding like the emissive lighting alone would dramatically change the look of the game, as we've seen on PC. And just bringing back some of the some of the detail that's missing, because the console versions are rather sparse in comparison. Just fewer things on screen, fewer NPCs. The whole thing just feels pared back and off in some way. And I think there's potential to bring all that stuff back.
Yeah, I mean, Cyberpunk 2077, if you look at what they're doing with the next generation consoles or current generation consoles at the moment, they still seem to be hitting CPU bottlenecks, which is why we have frame drops on Xbox Series consoles. And it's why we have the somewhat interesting lack of NPC density on PlayStation 5, which does run better. So, it seems to be a causal link there between the density of the city and the performance of the game. You ramp it up on Xbox, you get a performance drop. When you're looking at how the next generation consoles are used in backwards compatibility mode, I think you're still getting all of the CPU performance. So it's just the GPU side of things that is problematic, which, is eminently scalable. But in terms of getting that density back, I do think it's going to be the 30 FPS mode, which we're kind of speculating about here, that will actually bring back some of the splendor of the game. But yeah, the possibilities there. I'm kind of cautious about this. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, I'm more excited about this on PC because we've seen the ambition that CD Projekt RED had for ray tracing with Cyberpunk. If they're sort of backporting all of their ray tracing work that they've done in Cyberpunk to The Witcher 3 with specific enhancements for that kind of content, I think it could be really exciting. But again, I think we're probably looking at like a 30-60 divide there to actually keep 60 FPS, which I think is important for a lot of players, but also to actually utilize the next generation features. Again, I agree with you that actually waiting for this rather than punting it out ASAP is absolutely the right strategy. This one's just come out of nowhere. Literally, the docket has been updated in real time.
Yes, I updated it.
John has updated it. And it is Half-Life 2. It's getting updates targeting the Steam Deck. We actually had a question from a supporter saying, hey, we haven't really heard much from you about the Steam Deck recently. That's something we can possibly talk about as part of this discussion. But John, what's this all about?
So essentially what happened is Valve quietly has updated Half-Life 2. So this is the Half-Life 2. And they've made some interesting little tweaks to it. Firstly, they have added the option to increase the FOV to 110, which I believe was not the case before. They've also
Max 85 maybe last time.
Yeah, it was limited. And now they've also allowed for ultra wide resolutions to correctly display the UI. Those are fine. But the main thing, and I think this is what ties it more to the Steam Deck, is that they've apparently shifted it over to Vulkan, which of course is the best option for running on a Linux-based platform like Steam OS, of course. So it seems to me like there's not that much more to say about this right now, but it is interesting that Valve seems to be going back to their titles now and making these changes likely for the Steam Deck specifically. And anything else is just kind of gravy. Like, I'm sure they're like, okay, well, we can add these features to Half-Life 2 now. That's no problem. But I think it's the Vulkan thing that's telling. And I'll be curious to see how this continues, because I believe Portal 2 also was updated to Vulkan sometime earlier this year. So they're clearly going through their back catalog right now. And the thing is, though, is we know that Steam Deck hardware units are out there now for developers. Is that right? So the testing is happening. Developers are working on it. And I think right now it's just been quiet because, the work is ongoing. We know what the specs are. It's just a matter of ramping things up as we get towards launch and making sure the existing Steam back catalog that will run on the Steam Deck is in good shape for it, right?
I think they're using DXVK kind of layer to basically transpose DirectX support into Vulkan. I don't have any experience of that. This is one of these things that we've wanted to take a look at in depth for quite some time, but possibly when we get the Steam Deck and look at Proton and this sort of thing a bit more in depth. But yeah, we've had sort of questions about, hey, it's all gone a bit quiet on Steam Deck, and I actually think Valve has got quite an interesting strategy here, which is that, well, first of all, we were invited to go to see the Steam Deck at Seattle, but unfortunately there's a presidential decree stopping people from the UK visiting America at the moment, so that was a no-go. That ends November the 4th. I don't know if there's anything we can do around that or just wait until we get actual hardware. And in terms of actual hardware, Valve's strategy seems to have been basically to give wide-scale distribution of devices to the developers and then allow the developers to show their games running on the system, which I think is really quite a canny move, sort of guerrilla marketing, if you like, almost sort of delegating the marketing of the device to developers, which I think is actually quite cunning.
It's very Valve, though. It's very Valve. They love distributed stuff. You know, they did that for Team Fortress 2. They did it for a lot of the curation as well for Steam in its initial launching days. One thing that I think I recently read is that they also have dedicated people at Valve now that are going through the entire Steam catalog with DXVK in mind, or Proton, and looking for compatibility and looking to essentially complete their DirectX translation layer. I think that's great. I hope as a part of this curation too is the one thing that I mentioned back then, is that there's some sort of settings recommendations or profiles that are set up. Because, you know, all these games on Windows usually have, especially if you go to PC Gaming Wiki, they have configs. They have config files. So if they somehow package those with the game that you download on Proton, like the initial startup is already in Steam Deck config, which, you know, they can do that. They can literally do that if they wanted to. Like
the Steam controller. The Steam controller has all those profiles that are accessible even through Big Picture, right? And it kind of makes me consider, like, maybe they have a default config that they could use for Steam Deck, but what if they had like sort of community-based ones like the Steam controller, where essentially you could say like Alex's profile for the Steam Deck and just download that. You could literally do Alex's customized settings and put it out as a profile for the Steam Deck.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Or even, what if it went beyond the Steam Deck and they just, I don't know, allowed this kind of thing? Like, I feel like that's kind of an interesting sort of take on PC game that hasn't really been capitalized on as much. I mean, the wikis are one thing, but having a way to adjust settings by just downloading configurations that other people have made that could be fun.
This is an interesting one. Again, it's just turned up on the sheet today. Essentially now there's 120 hertz support for Dolby Vision on LG C10. Sorry, LG. Displays. I'm assuming this is going to be rolling out to the C1 as well, the C1 range. John, some interesting stuff that's emerged from your testing here, right?
The full story on this is that the C1 has had this support for a while now. And LG has been promising 4K 120 Dolby Vision for the CX/C10 for months and months and months. It was in the engineering firmware for a long time. It finally started rolling out this month, first in Korea, but now it showed up in Europe as well and possibly other markets. In my case, I actually had to go to LG's website. It didn't pop up on the automatic updater on the TV, but from the website, you could actually choose this firmware to download, install it via USB, and there you go. They have continued to say that they would like to introduce this for the C9 as well, but I'm not exactly holding out hope for that because there has been no evidence of it actually existing just yet, even though theoretically it should be capable. So we're going to have to wait and see on that. But essentially the idea is, you know, Xbox rolled out Dolby Vision recently, and it's a really nice option for displaying HDR content. And now you can use the full capabilities of the Xbox Series consoles, 120 hertz with Dolby Vision. But there's an interesting quirk/feature that I uncovered when testing it. I almost hesitate to say it because I'm afraid LG will remove it, but I don't think this is intentional. This is sort of like this is like a pro thing. It's only for very specific circumstances. Essentially, you can now use black frame insertion with VRR. This was not possible, and it's still not possible in an SDR mode or in HDR10 mode. It's grayed out, but when you have Dolby Vision on, you sure can turn it on. But the reason I say I don't think it's intentional is because it's only really usable at 120 frames per second right now. because if you try to use it at 60 frames per second or 60 hertz, it's insane, the flicker. Like it's very visible, difficult to look at flicker. So it wouldn't be recommended to use it that way. But I can say for sure that combining black frame insertion with 120 hertz VRR in, like, say, Halo 2 Anniversary, which is a good test, right? When you land on Delta Halo, that first grassy area, the frame rate does dip below 120. It's down into the 90s on Xbox. And so I like playing these with black frame insertion because it completely gets rid of motion blur. I think we used Halo, Alex, when I was demonstrating the benefits of this even. It's very, very nice. And combining this with black frame insertion is awesome. It looks really, really good. You actually do see some slight flicker as the frame rate adjusts. It's subtle, but it's there. But it's cool. So to me, it shows that this is technically feasible now. It can be done, but I can see why they would not want this enabled by default, because clearly it doesn't work with 60 hertz content like at all. So it's not really something that they would want users to be doing. But I would really like them to essentially allow this to continue, or at least maybe they can even go back and further tweak this and make it official. But I'm very encouraged and kind of excited to see that it is technically possible now.
I'd be curious if there's a way to scale the length of the black frame insertion to scale with the frame rate to make flickering less visible or something like that, John. I'm not sure if that's possible or if that would really get rid of all the benefits of low persistence. But it feels like it should be doable after a certain threshold, VRR plus black frame insertion. It seems like it should be there.
Well, there's actually 3 settings in there already that adjust the length of the black frame. So
the low, the medium, high, right?
You want for the best.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think inherently it is pretty difficult to do this. And I'm actually even wondering if it's even feasible when your frame rate's at like 60, just due to the nature of things. Like this is a piece. So this is a feature that's very, very, very select few PC monitors apparently allow the combination of VRR and ultra low motion blur, black frame insertion, or whatever. But I haven't tested them myself, so I can't say what the caveats or limitations are there. And I'm still not 100% certain it could be done at these lower frame rates, but as long as you're feeding it high frame rate content, it seems to be a very, very effective solution. So I don't know. It's worth checking out. Just know that if you play something at 60 hertz on your Xbox and you have this turned on in Dolby Vision, take caution. It's you're gonna see flickering like you've never seen flickering before.
Isn't the problem here that when you've got a variable refresh, that you've got to have your black frame to have a variable refresh as well?
Correct. Exactly.
So yeah, it's potentially a bit difficult. Of a minefield. It could be a sort of Here Be Dragons.
I think it is absolutely. But but I can say that it actually does work. Like it does work in the conditions. It's suitable for 120 frames per second games that have slowdown. Essentially, that's where you would want to use this, and it does look good and it works correctly. So unfortunately, with the way the Xbox works, I mean, you can't like only switch to 120 hertz for 120 FPS games, right? It's a
feels like that should be a profile thing.
So
almost,
I kind of wish there was a way to flick it over to 120 only when a game supports that, because then you could just kind of leave this on and not have to constantly adjust settings. But that's just me being picky about an option that not everybody's using.
So the actual variable rate, though, that does kind of concern me. I reckon you should try A Plague Tale: Innocence, because that seemed...
Didn't they fix that, though?
Did they? I don't know. But when we looked at it, essentially
I think they patched it.
What was happening there was that the game ran at anything from like 70 to 120 frames per second. And I do wonder whether it would be a bit gnarly at the lower end.
That's my guess. Is I feel like once you get maybe under a certain threshold, the flickering becomes too significant and not really usable. So I suspect that's kind of the issue. I don't know. This I can definitely see that this is probably very tricky to figure out in an effective way, and there really aren't many good examples of it that I've seen. So I don't know, but it certainly got the wheels turning.
Well, that's it for the news this week. And we were going to have a DF content discussion, as we usually do. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that we'd like to talk about is under embargo. Suffice to say, it's very exciting. I don't think you have to wait too long for it, but unfortunately, we just can't talk about it at the moment. I guess on the DF supporter program, Magazine Memories has just launched for Retro Tier. Mm-hmm. So if you want to see John and Audie, and potentially I'll join in at some point, discuss specific slices of gaming history viewed through the lens of the magazines at the time. This is really interesting stuff. But let's move on to supporter Q&A. Okay, so this question, first of all, from Dubuk Nathan. Sorry if I've mispronounced that. This is actually, in theory, a bit of a no-brainer, but I actually quite liked the question, so I've put it in. Hi there, I've been thinking recently about frame pacing in movies. Most movies we watch are 24 frames per second when it's not 23.87, though I personally watch them on my 60 Hz screen. So there should be uneven frame pacing, right? Right. Or are video players able to get around this? If this is an issue indeed, are there any ways to work around it? It's kind of like yes on all fronts, really, isn't it, John?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways that this works. First of all, for actual 60 Hz screens, traditionally they've used something called 3x2 pull down, where it is essentially, display. It's a frame persistence thing where one frame will display slightly longer than another, where it's like two frames, then 3 frames or something like that. But that still produces judder. That's not optimal.
So it is uneven frame pacing in movies.
It is absolutely
yeah,
by default.
It's common to see.
Unfortunately, if you just watch like a DVD on like a CRT back in the day, as good as DVD could look, this was a problem. You do get that judder. But for years now, TVs have essentially have solved this, I guess you could say, and in a multitude of ways. First of all, 120 hertz, 24 divides evenly into that. And most TVs, I know at least, when you feed them a 1080p or 4K 24 FPS signal, they actually switch to a mode where you're getting each frame repeated for the exact same amount of time. So you get perfect frame delivery. And it's using the 120 hertz refresh rate to do that. And that's the default kind of mode. But there's other unique examples of this as well, like the Pioneer Plasma that I still have downstairs, the second generation Kuro Plasma. That actually has a bespoke 72 hertz mode that it switches into when it gets 24 frames per second content. And so that means it's displaying, I guess, each frame, 3 times, I guess. So, that delivers perfect frame pacing. So movies look excellent that way. There's certainly, the thing about this is it's fun. There used to be some test scenes. One of the Star Trek films I think was really good for this, where it's like a long, slow pan across the star field with ships and everything. And if you're not using the correct cadence, it's Judder City and it looks horrendous. But yeah, I generally speaking, I think this problem is essentially solved.
In the PC movie player space, John, is that what you're going to talk about next, perchance?
PC movie player space, I would say, is tricky because in those cases, I think you want to be displaying a refresh rate that is divisible by 24 to make it work, essentially. And I think it should work if you do that. The problem is I think a lot of people, like if you load up like a laptop, most laptops are, they're 60 hertz, or if they're high end, they might be like 144 hertz, and whatever you're using, if it doesn't divide evenly into the refresh or into 24, it's not going to look right, essentially. There will be judder. I think most people probably don't care that much, but you're going to get that judder.
Well, I looked at, back in the day, I looked at this Dell XPS 13 2-in-1, and the screen had a 48 hertz mode, which is specifically obviously for movie content. It's 24 times 2. So that's, there are modes like that on certain screens.
There's a series of Panasonic Plasmas from the late 2000s that actually had 48 hertz modes as well. And curiously, you could actually see them flicker a little bit, kind of like 50 hertz PAL content.
Well, that's the ultimate hack, right, for movies in Powerland, 50 hertz territory. Basically, instead of running the movies at 24 frames per second, they just speed them up to 25.
movie ends like 2 minutes early.
They did do this.
Absolutely. You get a shorter film duration, but you do get a perfectly even presentation, even frame pacing in movies. But also, some people's voices tend to sort of work out okay when they're sped up. Other people's, you've got a kind of chipmunk effect. Also, specifically affects music as well. So, let's say, I think the one that stood out for me back in the day was The Living Daylights, the Bond movie.
Oh, the theme song.
Where it actually sounds kind of bizarre, because obviously you're used to listening to the music on, like the radio or on a CD or whatever, and then you watch the movie and it's like, what's going on here? This isn't right.
Pitching up.
I think the other one which stood out to me back in the day when I didn't quite understand what was going on was Back to the Future, The Power of Love. We saw it on TV. I actually saw it on TV, and then I went back to see it on DVD, and it was like, why is it so slow? And it wasn't slow; it was actually correct. But
it's the inverse of games.
Yes, exactly the inverse of games. Yeah.
The thing about this, though, is I don't think there's any other solution they could have used, right? If you just ran it at 24 frames per second within a 25 frames per second window, that would be bad. That would not look good at all. So I think this was the best you could do.
I also think back in the day there were problems with PAL DVDs because they were putting movies out at 25 frames per second, and they were resampling the audio to try to make it sound correct. And it didn't quite work out particularly well. But yes, this is a problem that has been solved, I think, because most screens do have some kind of, well, certainly the higher end ones, they anticipate that movies are going to be played on them and they need to be played correctly. Then it's down to the media player, right? So I think something like the Nvidia Shield would actually change the output frequency of the HDMI to support whatever the content was running at, which I think is really good. I'm not sure if the consoles do that, but
they do that, absolutely.
Okay, good stuff.
Any device that plays Blu-ray movies or 4K Blu-ray movies seems to do this. It's only on PC where things get weird, because then you have to rely on the software player to either do the conversion to itself, or technically you could set your PC to 24 hertz.
Yeah.
That's one thing I've dealt with recently. Was I was trying to watch a movie that was definitely 23.97 frames per second, and it was being a little bit troublesome. But then you just look at something like MPC-HC or whatever, and they have a sub menu about this where it says it'll detect the frame rate and actually set the proper monitor mode. It's it's only works in exclusive full screen, and you will actually see your monitor flicker to a new refresh rate when this is happening. If you don't see that happening,
that's awesome. Yeah. So there's actually an automatic thing now.
Yeah, well, I wasn't using MPC-HC. I was using MPC-BD, or I don't know. There's so many forks of it now. So it's one of those variants. You can find them, and they probably, a number of them have this now, but it definitely is a thing. It definitely worked out, but I would say it wasn't so intuitive, and it may not work with every screen out there, because it's not always 23.97. Sometimes it's exactly 24. And who even knows at that point? So in my humble opinion, just kind of avoid it a little bit on PC at the moment, unless you're really dedicated about it.
It's an issue on phones too, I think. Because most phones, if you're watching video content, except for some of the higher end ones that are 120 hertz, most are only 60. And so films just inherently have judder on there. They do not seem to switch to a special mode or anything, as far as I've seen.
I don't even know how Netflix does this, actually, because it has a lot of content, which is 23, 24. It also has 30 content.
So using the LG app and the OLED screen, it does actually seem to switch it to 24 hertz mode, which is good. I believe it does anyway. Or at least it does seem to display it with the correct cadence. And I guess that varies depending on the media player. I mean, that's built into the TV, so it can kind of do whatever it wants, I guess.
Yeah, obviously.
So just going back to the question, should there be uneven frame pacing in movies? Yes. Are video players able to get around this? Yes. If this is an issue indeed, are there ways to get around this? And as Alex said, who knows at this point? But generally,
kind of yes, maybe yes. So.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next question. This one from Brian Herlick. Do you think DLSS will become such an attractive prospect for console manufacturers that by the start of the next generation that either Microsoft or Sony will switch to Nvidia SOCs just to get it? Or do you think they will push their own AI-driven solutions? Alex?
I don't think they'll go to NVIDIA anytime soon, because NVIDIA isn't offering an SoC that is in the power performance bracket that they're looking for. Maybe if they did, for some reason, have an amazing ARM SoC that came out, maybe they would look at it and consider it and perhaps breaking their backwards compatibility chain to do that. But I doubt it. I think they would rather actually just lean on whatever innovations AMD will come up with in this space, or like Microsoft, who's admitted that they're working on their own, regardless of whatever AMD is doing.
Yeah, I think the concept of moving away from x86 is going to be quite challenging for console manufacturers that are trying to build persistent ecosystems across the generations. Certainly, we're seeing that from Microsoft, where, when you look at if you go back to the reveal of Xbox 360 games running on Xbox One, just the concept that this was possible was kind of crazy. Nobody thought it would happen, and yet they did it. But the work required to get there was simply immense. Meanwhile, the transition from generations from Xbox One to Series X, from PS4 to PS5, has been a lot more graceful. And I don't think AI-driven upscaling is a good enough reason to kind of break away from that. And secondly, as Alex says, it's a technology that can be replicated. We're already seeing that Intel are looking to essentially take that technology and make it more open, and to get it running on their own GPUs, and to present compatibility paths for every other vendor out there. So yeah, I would expect to see Nvidia retain its existing relationship with Nintendo. That kind of makes sense to me. But going forward, I can't see them shifting away from x86. Anything to add to that, John?
No, not really. I think you guys pretty much got that.
Okay, next question from Dylan Sammet. In your videos covering the remastered Crysis trilogy, you mentioned that Crysis 3 was really trying to push tech at the time, but it was held back by the limitations of Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Are there any games that you feel were trying to be super innovative in terms of tech, but hardware held it back at the time and deserves a second chance on current systems? John, I can think of one colossal candidate here.
It's tough to think of ones. I'm going way back to the 90s. I'm thinking on N64, you got Violence Killer Turok, New Generation, also known as Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. That's my favorite one for this, because they were trying to push so much stuff, like skeletal animation system, these like gigantic levels, and like dynamic light sourcing all over the place, and just it's ridiculous what they were attempting to do. But the N64 just folds like a house of cards, and it runs. It's horrible. It's basically unplayable on the original hardware. And to me, that always stands out as one of those games that runs so poorly, it's shocking that they felt it was okay to release. That, of course, did get a second chance. I would also include like Perfect Dark in there as well, where they were just trying to do so much with the hardware, and really pushing like technology in ways the N64 just couldn't cope with. And yeah, it folds pretty hard.
Well, the big game that I was thinking of was obviously Cyberpunk 2077, which that's kind of super recent, right? Where they've taken so much time to get it sort of functional on last gen systems, but it's still only really acceptable on the PlayStation 4 Pro for whatever reasons. And the compromises to the vision, I think, are kind of unacceptable. You've got a city with barely any people in it. So that one, I think they should have waited and concentrated on the new generation of systems, but I don't think they could have from a financial perspective. It just wouldn't have made sense.
It's tricky because that one's still, you're right, recent, but some of the other ones I would have said in the past have received updates. Like, for instance, I think Far Cry 3 is a really good example of this, where what they were trying to do, like, it's clear that the PS3 and 360 just weren't up to the task, and the frame rate is usually in like 15 to 25 with nonstop tearing. I mean, they're horrible. It's insane that you would ever want to play it on those machines. But obviously, there was a really interesting, good game concept in there. And, well, the PC solved that on day one, but then there was sort of that remastered release, I think, that kind of solved it. And I kind of feel like in general, this applies to a lot of games during the PS360 era, where, especially in the latter half of that generation, like games were just being released that were big budget titles that just run like, they don't run well. Let's just say, you know what I mean? It's constant low frame rate, screen tearing all over the place, bad image quality. You can see that what they're trying to do with the technology, the machines weren't ready for it. And I think, Alex, we were talking about this the other day, where I think on that generation of machines, it would have been smart to push slightly less advanced visual techniques in favor of clean image quality and performance. Like, you know, I did that Ridge Racer video. You hold up Ridge Racer 7, it's a 1080p 60 game. It holds up better than just about all of these games we're talking about on PS3, just by the nature of, you know, the tech. They knew the tech wasn't ready, so they used sort of tried and true rendering techniques, but those techniques are attractive. Like the end result is still beautiful. It doesn't need to be cutting edge, and it runs like a dream. And there wasn't not nearly enough of that during that generation.
Well, the generation behind that one that I was just recently thinking about was Shadow of the Colossus, where that game was pushing like really cool IK systems, really cool post-processing features, and, you know, vistas and
simulating per
transparency
pixel
usage.
motion blur, basically.
Yeah. And, you know, like simulating HDR pipeline before that even existed on that console. So, and that ran horribly too. I would put it in the unplayable territory for my eyeballs. But that, you know, that got a port, and then it got a remake. And those are all great. Thankfully, we have less and less of this over time due to porting that has happened. Remasters are a bit of an annoyance because I kind of feel like they're always just like, you know, they're just releasing the game sometimes with very bare bones features. I have a conflicted opinion now about remastering at times. Also, emulation has been helping these out recently. A lot of PS3 releases that have not seen porting are coming to the playable realm right now in the emulation space, which I'm really happy about. One that happened at the end of the PS3 gen was kind of The Last of Us. It did not run super well on PlayStation 3. I definitely remember that, and I kind of feel like one that's stuck on the PlayStation 3 as well is the last, the Insomniac shooter, the last one, the third one, that's very much like Half-Life, John.
Resistance 3.
Resistance 3 is still stuck.
It runs fine, but...
Yeah, but its image quality is super poor. I don't know. I would really love to see that somehow updated one of these days, like a Resistance collection, because, you know, those games, they're not super awesome, but they're cool, they're technologically interesting for the time period, and I would like to see them leave the PS3 behind.
I want to venture one more example that I think is possibly one of the best from my perspective, because it actually ultimately hurt the games. Thief, Deadly Shadows, and Deus Ex, whatever it was called, the second one, Invisible War. So what they wanted to bring these series to consoles, first of all. So they targeted the Xbox, very capable machine, of course, but still limited in terms of memory and other things like that. They also wanted they used Unreal Engine, but they wanted to push sort of a unified like lighting and shadow model where everything cast shadows and, you know, lots of dynamically lit scenes. And they pulled that off. The problem is that what this ended up meaning for the game was that every single stage had to be subdivided up into these tiny little zones. So there's loading screens everywhere, like everywhere you go. And this was something that was so critical to the fundamental fabric of Thief and Deus Ex. And so by essentially getting rid of that, shrinking the game, it kind of really hurt it. Like, I think Thief still turned out pretty good, all things considered, but Deus Ex suffered a lot from this. And this is just a case of they had these ambitions for what they wanted to do visually. They went for it, and the machine just couldn't deliver what they wanted to achieve. And the game suffered as a result. And even if you play it on PC, it does not matter because the core game itself was impacted by this decision.
Let's move on. Next question. Abby Coley. What are your favorite TAA implementations, or what were the early highlights? I've noticed Judgment on Next Gen has a great deal of shimmering / dithering in the 60 FPS mode. One thing you've talked about before is Insomniac's TAAU. I know early implementations like The Order or Uncharted quickly impressed me during the PS4 gen. John?
If he's asking about early highlights, this might be a controversial thing, but I'm going to say that I actually think Crysis 2's original anti-aliasing for the time period was pretty interesting and smart. It's very flawed now, right? Like the DX9 approach, but I think considering you could really see what they were trying to solve with that solution, and I think it was really pretty effective at the time of release, and it was kind of a good step forward. I mean, you compare that to like, say, Halo Reach,
that was terrible,
which tried, and that was just ghosting city. It was awful. Crysis 2 was dramatically better.
That was essentially jittered samples, right?
It was, yeah.
It is, yeah.
I mean, they were trying to solve that problem, but...
Alex, any thoughts on this?
I thought Rises was really good. That came out early. That looked really good when it came out.
Crytek again.
But they were working there. There was they were working with people outside of Crytek to get anti-aliasing. That's how SMA started at that point in time. And other early ones.
I think maybe Rainbow Six Siege deserves some kudos.
Yeah,
they were trying to do. Wasn't it like checkerboarding? Basically, an early form of checkerboarding.
Yeah, actually, it was like the MSAA trick or whatever.
Actually arrived before the PS4 Pro, where this kind of technique was really kind of required. And actually, if we're talking about sort of more modern techniques, kind of all kicked off with PS4 Pro, because suddenly developers were faced with a 4.2 teraflop GPU that needed to be able to power a 4K display. And I remember when I first went to see the Pro, it was really interesting to see all the software that was lined up, because For Honor looked really good. And I don't think you could tell that it was running at native 1440p. Similarly, we got our first look at Marvel's Spider-Man as the... very similar technique there, which I still think holds up, which I still think looks tons better than, say, FSR on PC. There's some really sort of impressive stuff that was done quite early on there.
This kind of doesn't count, but in my mind it does a little bit. The PlayStation 2 and its field rendering modes. Because effectively, you're literally alternating odd and even scan lines rapidly on a CRT screen. So they were getting away with sometimes drawing like only 224 lines per frame, but the effective result looked like a 448 or 480, line game. And some of the developers went really crazy with this. Like, of course, Ezra Driesbach and them from Lobotomy did Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance on the PS2, which does some kind of crazy per field like super sampling, where it's almost like they're effectively rendering out like 1280 by 224 or something. Some really weird kind of resolution, where it's not actually that, but they're merging the frames in such a way that gives it this super sampled look on a CRT, which is really impressive to behold, but it's ultimately kind of like a rendering trick using the characteristic of the display.
So the question here is talking about the Order 1866, but I'm pretty sure that was 4X MSAA.
Yeah, that was MSAA.
It was 4X CSAA or whatever it is, EQAA, and then a TAA pass as well. So there was TAA
Did have
there.
a TAA pass, okay.
Yeah, that's how they got the. I mean, the game is pretty slick looking.
Absolutely,
it is still today.
Yeah, so. I think, but like in modern stuff, I actually, a lot of people on PC don't like it, but I actually like Filmic SMAA from the Call of Duty games quite a bit. I think they allow you to choose the level of sharpness that I think is very nice. That's usually, it's not done with the sharpening slider. It's actually like changing how it converges. Which I think is really nice. And I kind of want to say I like the IdTech 8X TSAA. I think that's pretty good.
Okay, let's move on to the next question from Sabak.
It was a good one.
I love that name.
Would you ever consider making shorter videos, perhaps covering games the team are less interested in, but viewers have requested, or patches for games you've covered already that make a noticeable change to performance? More of an overview lasting around 5 minutes to go alongside the usual in-depth video. Would this be feasible, or would it go against the DF ethos too much? I don't know, Alex.
I don't know. If I'm not covering a game that I like, it's hard to make the content in general. I don't know. It's weird. I don't know.
I think the answer to this is pretty simple. And I think this fundamentally shows a lot. This is a good education moment of what it takes to make these videos, right? The length of the video is not the reason that they take X amount of time to make. It's the research that has to be done to get the data, right? You have to capture the game. You know, when you take in capturing the different versions, you take into account the pixel counting necessary to get the resolution stuff. Like, just getting the information is the time consuming part. So if we just made a 5-minute video out of that, it wouldn't actually save much time at all. It would take basically just as long, really. And, you know, we would get a lot less out of it. And even then, like, if it's multiple versions of a game, like 5 minutes isn't even really enough to say everything necessarily. So it's not really feasible, and it doesn't really make sense.
It's enough to get the raw metrics out there, but, you know, this kind of returns us to where DF was in 2015, 2016, where we did make 5-minute videos. And, you know, I don't think they were as interesting as the content we put out today. And I realize there's...
I also don't like making them.
And, you know, if,
they're not enjoyable
in
to
terms of this sort of concept of, you know, covering patches and getting the raw metrics and stuff, again, I'm going to talk about VG Tech, who does some excellent work. Underappreciated YouTube channel. Check it out. So, yeah, I mean, there is people out there that will take a look at this stuff, but it's... I guess the problem there is similar to what we have, which is that, you know, just sourcing all of these metrics is time consuming in itself. All that we really save is a bit of editing time, and that's about it really. And fundamentally, we can talk about our experiences of the game for free almost. You know, so it's not just about the metrics, it's about what we think of them. And just going back to a example analogy that I've used many times in the past, which is, you know, let's say you're about to buy a car and, okay, I want to know the 0 to 60. Okay, so you get a number. What are you going to do with that number? Not a lot. Don't you want to know what the reviewer thinks about the car? That's kind of a bit more important. You know, maybe it's the sort of bias of information shifts when you're talking about tech analysis, but it's okay to have the numbers, but what do those numbers mean? And if we can get that information across, then we should do it, because the actual overhead is just, you know, a bit more time in the editing process. That's about it, really. Final question. User with the fascinating hacker alias, James the Naked Snake. Okay, fair enough.
Metal Gear Solid 3 fan.
Question. Which console generation, not a specific system, would you hate to go back to more than the rest? John?
Early 80s 8-bit consoles. Anything pre-NES. I actually had some of that stuff growing up, but I don't really enjoy it.
So you're not an Atari VCS man?
Nope, not at all. That's a bridge too far for me.
Okay. Alex?
That's actually, you know, I was originally going to say something a bit more biting, but that is actually pretty true, because those game experiences are very short. Sometimes due to the lack of system memory, they're very shallow. I think, you know, if they had more system memory, they could be a little bit more depth. Like you'd see on the PC, you could see like PC games in the 80s, you know, you could have like long-term adventures, but like those consoles back then, a little bit less so.
Using the term system memory kind of doesn't even apply.
Yes,
like, the VCS is literally drawing
reading
like,
from a tape.
You're drawing as the beam scans down the screen, right? It's insane.
So I think that those are really rough to return to. There are some fun looking games visually from that time, just that just look nostalgic. But I don't think I could play them so much so these days.
So when he says which console generation, it's all of them before the NES. I mean, if you're thinking a bit more modern, the problem is that, that you can't really do that. I guess we've lamented the general downturn in performance from the PS360 generation. We talked about it just now, in fact. But yeah, I mean, if we're not allowed to talk about specific systems, I still think in terms of longevity of the, if we're talking about NES upwards, the longevity of a particular system's games, frame rate really does have a big impact on that. And I think, N64 has some issues in still holding up today. GoldenEye at 10 to 12 frames per second.
It's actually not that low. That's Perfect Dark.
I'm pretty sure. Well, I'm pretty sure the 4-player was that low.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's quite an interesting question.
I did the metrics on N64 once, and I believe, I can't remember the exact number, but it's under 10 games that run at 60 frames per second on N64.
How many of them are 2D, I wonder?
There's basically no 2D games on N64. I mean, there's like a few, but barely any. Versus like Saturn and PlayStation. Like PlayStation has like 200 something games that are 60 FPS. Some are 2D, some are 3D. And Saturn is kind of similar in terms of its overall library. Like they actually have a solid amount of 60 FPS games, but not the N64.
So not exactly the most entertaining answer there, James the Naked Snake. But there it is. Okay, so look, we're going to wrap this up now. Thanks so much for joining us for this DF Direct. And of course, if you like the content, please do like, subscribe, /share, ring the bell for those notionally instant notifications. DF Supporter Program. Get involved. Join the team. We're on Discord, talking about all manner of stuff. And it's a great place to be. Plenty of bonus material, early access. It's all awesome. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.